Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and it's your job to draw what you see. We'll have an artist joining us, giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It's entirely up to you. You can watch this video again once it's finished, and you can also download the reference photographs so you can carry on your work after the session. Lots of people watch these sessions twice. The first time round they just watch, and the second time round they watch and draw along. I hope you enjoy the session. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this Umber video. In this video I'll be drawing two 30-minute poses on white paper. And as you can see, I'm first going to tone the paper using the side of an old piece of willow charcoal. What I tend to do is just rub it all over the paper and then use a bit of tissue or some kitchen roll to just wipe this into the paper to create a nice middle tone. Now you may have to do this several times to create the mid-tone, so I'm just going to go over this again. Now for this video I'm only going to be using charcoal, but of course feel free to use whatever materials you prefer to use. And you can find all the materials I like in the materials box below the video. So what I've done here is just place the top, bottom and the sides of the skull on the page, making a rough square. Now when doing this you could make it of course taller or wider. And as you can see, I'm using my charcoal here to compare the two against each other. And they should be roughly square. And this is called comparative measurements. I'm comparing two things against each other. And I'll be using this throughout the video. And one measurement I really like to use for the face is comparing the main 3/3 of the face to each other. That's top of the skull or top of the forehead to the brow line to the bottom of the nose, and finally bottom of the nose to the chin. And once I've got these three main measurements, I can start breaking these up even further using the same principle of comparative measurements. So for instance, if I want to divide the bottom of the brow to the bottom of the nose into separate sections for the brow area and where the nose starts coming at, I can again use comparative measurements to see how far up it is in the picture and then try to copy this on my drawing. So in this case I can see that the bridge of the nose is about 1/3 down from the top of the brow. The same thing of course with the rest of the features. For instance, with the lips, I can look for quarters, halves or thirds. In this case I can see that the bottom of the lip is about halfway down from the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin. So this system of comparative measurement, comparing the quarters, halves or thirds for whatever points that you see on the photograph to what you're drawing, is really useful for getting the likeness, getting the main proportions and so on of whatever you will be drawing. So it's very worth just learning this system and trying to work with it. So let's have a look what else we can find using these measurements. Now for instance, if I divide the skull into halves, I can see that halfway up is an interesting point, which is the bottom of the eye. And if I follow this line across, I can see that the ear will sit underneath this line. And for the bottom of the ear, I can do the same thing. And I can see that it sits somewhere between the bottom of the nose and the dividing line of the lips. Now this is all verticals, but of course you can also use this horizontally. So if I want to find the front of the ear, I can divide the skull into thirds, and I can see it sits just in front of that 1/3 measurement. And this is quite useful because on the other side, I can see that the edge of the eye socket is on the other 1/3 line. And so you can really think of the face like a puzzle. Once you found one area, you can use this to find other areas. So for instance, in this case, the jawline is connected to the bottom of the ear. So I can use a line to connect the two. And so I'm slowly getting closer and closer to resolving the puzzle of the face. Now, of course, I'm just using some examples here, but feel free to look yourself and see what else you can see on the 1/3, halves, or quarters. And of course, if you have any questions about this or anything else related to comparative measurement, feel free to let me know in the comments if you're watching this live. Now, one thing that relates to comparative measurements is using imaginary lines to connect shapes up together. So for instance, if I look at the hairline, I can make a line go through the top of the brow, and I can see that's where it changes direction. So I've just made an imaginary line and connecting the two up, which helps me find the various areas that I'm looking for. Another example of this is the neck. If I use the diagonal of the neck and see where it is pointing, I can see it's pointing roughly to the top of the brow. And I can use this imaginary diagonal to place the neck. Same thing for the front of the neck. I can use the front of the eye socket through the corner of the nose and the corner of the mouth to find the other side of the neck. And this of course is very useful because it gives me a few measurements in one go. Corner of the nose, corner of the mouth, as well as of course the front of the neck. So it's always a good idea to see how various elements of the drawing connect to each other. And that way you make sure that you're not just drawing an eye or the lips in isolation, instead you're drawing the whole thing as a whole as it is in nature. Now I use this technique for lines, but I also use it when drawing shapes, which is the next thing I'm going to be doing. And really what I'm trying to do here is divide the portrait up into shadows and light shapes, with nothing in between for now. And what really helps me here is to use straight lines and think of them in terms of abstract shapes. So for instance, I'm drawing a little arrow shape here around the top lip. Now I want to talk a little bit about some anatomical landmarks because they do help you find the shapes that are important to find rather than just random little details. And that's important with a portrait like this because there's a lot of shapes in his face. And that's great to draw, but it's important as an artist to look at what's the important shape and what's a less important shape. And the first bit I want to talk about is the muscle that goes around the face from the corner of the nose. You can see it surrounds the corner of the mouth. And in his case, we can see a line in his face. And this is something that happens more as you age. With children, there will be a lot of fat deposits underneath the skin, smoothing the skin out. And as you get older, these will disappear a tiny bit and make the face, in my opinion anyway, a little bit more interesting to draw because there's a lot more little shapes that you can find. And so I'm drawing in the shadow shapes here, but I'm noticing how they connect to the muscle around his face. If you find that there's a bit too much texture going on in the shapes, feel free to use a blending tool, like for instance a stump, to flatten them, meaning getting rid of some of the detail into the shapes. Again, really trying to aim for a clear framework between light and dark shapes with nothing in between. Now again, a little bit about anatomy here. From the top of the ear, around the whole of the ear, there's going to be a hard bit of bone called the zygomatic arch, or what we call the cheekbone. And it goes to the corner of the cheekbone, which is the bottom of the eye socket. And often you'll see a little triangle of darkness here just below that cheekbone. And that's also something that you would try to highlight or low light if you'd be doing makeup, for instance. And really all that is just trying to highlight what's already there, which is the cheekbones stick out and therefore create a little bit of a shadow shape there. And again, in an older face, you would see this a bit more clearly than in a younger face. Now, inside this eye socket will sit the eyeball. You can think of this as a round shape. And the eyeball, of course, has the lids protecting it and sitting on top. And so following the top of the brow bone and the circle of the eyeball and the lids on the top and the bottom can be really helpful because it informs the shapes that we can see on the eye. And these shapes follow the bridge of the nose down to the bottom of the eye socket and the top of that cheekbone. So knowing a little bit about the basic anatomy of the face is very useful because it can help you find the shapes and makes it all a little bit less mystifying, especially with an area like this where there's lots of wrinkles and humps and bumps that can really easily distract from the more important anatomical shapes. And so this bridge of the nose that I spoke about just now goes all along to the tip of the nose, which usually sits a bit wider and a bit lower. And this then connects to the wider area of the nostrils. So as you can see, the shapes that I made at the very start are now slowly getting more precise. So I'm just going to do this for a few minutes. And of course, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments if you're watching this live. Now you may notice that I've started cheating a little bit here. I'm not just using the two tones that I told you about at the start of the video. I've started using darker accents in some of the areas of the shadows. And really what I'm doing here is dividing my shadows into two separate tones. So I've still got the clear dividing line between the lights and the darks. And they're still both very dark because of course they are in shadow, but in one I'm using a blending tool and the other one I am not at all, so it makes it a little bit darker. And this allows me to put accents in the shadows without making it confusing for the viewer, because especially if you have a face like this with lots of small shapes, we want to make it clear and not more confusing. So for instance, with the ear right now, I'm just going to draw the main areas of the ear and then use my two tones to shade it in. Now I do have an ear-only video for those of you who have subscribed. But for now, I'll just give you the basics of the main areas of the ear. And you can think of the ear as a sort of shell-like entity. It's higher and has a ridge along the outside. And then there's some shapes that curve inwards towards the middle of the ear. And the main shape you can think of as a sort of Y shape, forked near the top and gets more narrow towards that center of the ear. And finally, there's a little bit of cartilage just protecting that middle of the ear. Now, once I've got these main shapes in, I'm going to start dividing them into darker and lighter shadows. So first, just adding in the shadow shapes using the knowledge of the anatomy that I have. And then using the blending tool to gently lighten these, to only leave a few dark accents where I want to call attention for the viewer. And this can be a very personal choice. You may not even want any details in the ear. So the amount of detail and accents is entirely up to you, but I would advise to only add it in areas where you want the viewer to look. There's an interesting shape or there's a really hard edge, so it makes sense to use a detail. And I'm using the stump in areas where I want stuff to be soft and a bit less in focus. So what I can do now is go over my shadow shapes and start adding those darker accents. I'm generally going to do this in areas where I see a sharp line along the shadow shape or where I see some darker detail. So for instance, the pupils and the irises will be a bit darker. And that's also where I want the viewer to look. So I'm going to slightly darken around the eyes there. And then maybe blend in areas where I want it to be a little bit less harsh or there should be a little bit less detail. So for the last few minutes of the pose, I'm just going to work using dark accents in the dark shapes, not using any accents in the light shapes. I'm going to try and call attention to certain areas in the shadows using these very limited means. Next pose, I will start building onto this technique to make it a bit more complicated, a bit more interesting. In the meantime, if you have any questions at all, of course, I'm here in the chat if you're watching this live, and otherwise, I will speak to you at the beginning of the next pose. Alright, so now I can start adding in the main box of the head and just trying to estimate the width versus the height here. And I find using comparative again very useful here, because when I measure the three thirds, bottom of the chin to bottom of the nose, to top of the brow, to top of the forehead, I can see that the width of the skull is about 2/3. So top of the brow to bottom of the chin is roughly equal to the width of the skull. And again, just like in the first pose, I'm gonna start looking for interesting landmarks on the half, quarter, and thirds. And the first one I can see is already halfway down the face. So if I measure the face and divide it into two equal parts, I can see that is the bottom of the eyes. And conveniently, this also lines up with the top of the ears on the sides. Again, using those imaginary lines to connect various measurements. When I divide bottom of the nose to bottom of the chin into two halves, I can see that this is roughly the lower lip, and it roughly again lines up with the bottom of the ears. And again, just like I used in the first pose, I can also use these comparative measurements horizontally. So for instance, if I want to know how wide the ear is, I can simply look at how many times it fits into the width of the skull. Same thing for the shadow shapes that are lined up with the bottom of the nose and the nose itself. I can look at how many times it fits into the width of the skull, which I see is about 4. And then I can take over this measurement now a little bit about the planes of the nose. You can see it's wider near the nostrils and gets more narrow towards the top of the bridge of the nose. I can see it's about halfway the eye socket. And then I can continue with the eye socket, trying to look for those shapes. Now again, a little bit about anatomy. It's good to see the shape of the eye socket, and you can see it's the widest around the top of the ear and then narrows towards the side of the brow and the side of the forehead, so it should be the same on the other side. And so by combining the top of the brow and the side of the cheekbones, you can already see the hollow of the eye sockets, and this is important when you're drawing a portrait in charcoal. And just like I did in the first pose, using my measurements I made before can be another piece of the puzzle of the portrait. So now I've got the eye sockets in, I can use that to vertically draw one of those imaginary lines to find the sides of the chin. And once I've got those sides, I can use that to figure out the angle of the jawline, and again, imaginary line connecting this up to the bottom of the earlobe. Following the line of the fold of the outside of the mouth to find the corners of the mouth, and then finally using a bit of comparative measurement to figure out the location of the top lip. So now I've got most of the main structural elements of the face in, and so I can start looking at those black and white shapes or dark and light shapes. And to find these, I'm really following the lines that I made earlier. So I can see here that the bottom of the lip casts a shadow to the top of the chin, and the side of it follows the corner of the mouth. And if I need to add the darker accents in the shapes, that's really fine as well. I just use a non-blended charcoal versus a blended charcoal. And so here I'm going to start with adding some shapes for the eyes. Again, first looking at the eye socket itself, and then finding the rough shape of the eyeball. And once I've got this in, I can follow the eyeball with my charcoal to find the top lid. Of course, if you have any questions about this, about the shapes or the measuring, anything else I'm covering in this video, feel free to ask me in the comments if you're watching this live. So a little bit quicker than the first pose, we've now arrived at a place where we've got a very clear dark versus light shape. And again, we've divided that up into darker and lighter tones for the shadows. And so now, just like I did in the first pose, I'm gonna really punch in some of the darker accents into those shadows and really trying to darken the shadows, because that will make the highlights pop out even more a bit later. So what I tend to do is use the charcoal directly on the outline of the shadow and then blending the inside of the shadow. And this gives a bit of an atmospheric feel to the shadows themselves. And of course I can add a few accents where I need to have them, for instance here, for the overlap of the neck. And then what I'm trying to do here is really trying to get rid of any lines. Instead, I'm converting everything into shapes. And all of the shapes should have a dark outline and a blended middle part. And so I'm really trying to darken the shadows. And like I do here in the eye socket, outline the shapes. And finally put in any accents that I see should be a bit darker. And what's nice about this is that I can really take my time building up the tones and slowly get closer to an accurate drawing. Because every time I add a bit more darkness or some detail to the shadows, I can adjust the drawing as well. So again, here on the other eye, I'm just trying to adjust some of the outlines, trying to add some detail in the eye. But at the same time, I'm not really committing yet. I know I can still do a bit better, but I'm trying to just slowly get to the most accurate shape that I can see. And the same thing on the nose here. I'm just adding the tip of the nose versus the wings of the nose, trying to make it a bit more accurate, and then using a blending tool to blend the two together. So this is the way I slowly build up the tones in the shadows. And I'm going to do this for a few more minutes. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments if you're watching this live. So I haven't really spoken about the lighter tones yet. And the reason for this is that you don't really need any charcoal using this technique. So instead what I'm going to do is lighten the ground of the paper that I made earlier. So for instance, his hair is actually lighter than the background, so we see a little bit of a shadow below the overhang of the hair. I can quickly just sketch this in, and then next I can take the rubber and just draw in the hair. So I'm using the rubber as a drawing tool, not just as an eraser to erase any mistakes. And just like I did for the dark shapes, I'm trying to get rid of any lines here and just working with blocks of tone. So I'm trying to get rid of any lines. For instance, at the top of the head, we don't actually see a line there. So I'm just going to get rid of this and instead use the rubber to outline the hair. So I can now work my way down, looking for blocks of highlights and trying to get rid of any lines. So with the forehead, I can see the highlight sits in the middle of the forehead there. And I can even blend some of the hair into that forehead, again getting rid of any outlines. Now of course there are details on there, for instance the wrinkles of his forehead. And it could be tempting to just draw these in using the charcoal, but this actually makes it part of the shadows, which is something you don't really want in the lights. So any details in the lights can't be darker than the tone of the paper. And similarly, any highlights in the shadows can't be lighter than a blended charcoal tone. And this keeps the shadows and the lights nice and separate. So I'm just working my way down here, adding some highlights in the bridge of the nose, as well as the eye sockets. And it's a good idea to squint here because it's very easy to look at a little bit of light in the shadow and think that's really bright because of course it's surrounded by so much dark tones. So it starts feeling really bright by comparison. And so when I squint at the actual image, I can see that the overall eye socket is a lot darker than areas like the forehead, for instance. So squinting when I'm trying to find these highlights is really useful. Alternatively, when you put a highlight in and it seems a bit harsh, feel free to just use a stump or your finger, whatever you're using to blend, to gently blend this in. And same thing for the shadow lines. If they feel a bit harsh, again feel free to use a blender and run it along the edge of the shadow. And this will soften the edge and make it just a little bit more integrated. So for instance on the lip here, feel like it's a bit harsh. So I'm going to run my stump along the edge, which then of course blends this in with the rest of the tones. So you could say that finishing and adding detail to a face is less about putting information in rather than adjusting the information you've already got. So I'm not really changing the shape of my shadows here, rather I am using the blending tool to integrate them more or less into the tone of the paper. And this is where all of the hard work of the measuring and the putting down and separating of the shadows can really pay off. The more work you can put into creating and adding detail in and around the shadows and the lights, the more realism you get for the drawing. So I'm adding a few more softer integrated edges along the nose there, trying to add some darker accents in there as well, and keeping in mind that I shouldn't go lighter in the shadows, just darker. And of course the opposite is true for the lights. I should never darken the lights, just use my rubber to highlight them, and then again using my blending tool to blend and integrate these tones. So I'm just going to continue working on the eye sockets here, trying to blend the tones, adding some dark accents in there. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments if you're watching this live. Otherwise, I will speak to you at the end of the video. Alright, so that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. And I hope that you feel like you've learned something about how to separate your values and how to add detail into these tones. If you'd like to show us your work, feel free to use the photograph button right here in the chat, or otherwise use the hashtag #RawUmberLife if you use Instagram.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to photograph your works, put them on Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a portrait drawing session every Sunday at 4 p.m. and figure drawing every Wednesday at 8 p.m. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.